I don't see it. It's actually pretty. That probably isn't what we're looking for.
Do you have?
I don't know why, but the Zoom is clunky. Maybe that's why I get it. Try.
Maybe.
Let's try this again.
It's a good joke. They messed up.
Yeah. Sounds so. Ah, that was better.
There we go.
Didn't like it being full screen.
I'm gonna chop off that front part before I post it.
All right, so I've been trying. This is a new talk. First time I'm giving it. I could have spent another week on my slides because when are you ever done with your talk? But this was the first title I came up with, and I didn't really like it. So it's kind of long. I asked ChatGPT to shorten that, and it did. That's not. It's all right. Maybe that, because I'm going to talk about tonight is building up compose files to have a flexible development environment with Rails, or anything really. But since I do Rails all day long, that's going to be the focus. So I'm Spike, at SpikeX pretty much anywhere except Mastodon, where I'm on Ruby Social. Currently I'm the principal software engineer at a company called Praecipio. They mostly do Atlassian consulting, so if you need your Jira fixed, let me know. I'll hook you up. But I have spent a long time mostly doing contract work through Dojo 4 and various other companies. So I end up working on a lot of projects. And your machine can fill up quickly when you're on 6 different projects, some of which might need Mongo or Postgres or this other version of Postgres or PostGIS or MySQL or whatever. And so over the years, I've come up with a strategy for managing all these things using Docker for local development. So who uses Docker? Less than I thought. So Docker is a system that's composed of basically 3 things, and I'm going to gloss over everything here. If you want to know what Docker really is, this isn't it. But this will get you sort of a conceptual framework. So a Docker starts with an image, and an image is basically a disk image, a CD. If you were old enough to have installed an OS from a CD, it's very much like that, because you can't modify an image once it exists. You can build a new one. And then a volume, which is basically a disk drive. Weirdly enough, Apple doesn't have an emoji for a disk drive, so you get a floppy. And then a container, which is effectively a server. Under the hood, it's much cooler than that and much more efficient than that. But conceptually, that's what you've got. You're building little servers that are running on your local computer, or if you're deploying this way, on a physical server. And so you can spin up a Postgres server. There's another piece of Docker, which is Docker Compose. Docker itself is pretty hard to use. Compose is from the Docker people. It's a thing that makes it easier to run multiple Docker containers. So if I want to have my Rails app and my Postgres server, it manages all the stuff that you would need to do to build a network, have those things talk to each other, have something that's like DNS so that they can find each other. Nobody I know uses plain Docker. Everybody uses Compose or other tools that are built to simplify it. And Compose is what we're going to be using here. So why would we use Docker? Dependencies are automatically installed. So I can create a Git repo with the proper Docker and Docker Compose config files. You can pull it down and it will install Postgres and Redis and whatever else you need. Everything lives in these Docker volumes and images. So when you're done with a project, you can just delete the thing and it's gone. There's no version conflicts. If you need different versions of Postgres, and you can have them. You need different versions of Ruby. This will manage your Ruby versions because everything is just contained in this little world of its own. And as I started to say, things are automatically removed. This was a big thing for me. I still, on this computer, I have Postgres databases that are like 10 years old and I have no idea what they are. And someday I should delete them. But when I'm using Docker at the end of a project, I can just say, delete all the files you've created, and it's all gone. And my machine, and because they don't live in your local hard drive, they're in their little volumes, these little virtual hard drives. They also don't like clutter up your things like Spotlight on the Mac. If you ever search for anything, you get 500 node modules from, and they're invisible, which is nice. So why don't use it? A lot of people who tried this, even a few years back, found it was very slow. It isn't really slow anymore. This is very specific to Macs too, because the way Docker works is, so I have files on my computer, I'm editing them locally I use Emacs, but you all can use VS Code. And those files need to be in the container so that Rails can run them, but they also need to be on my local machine to edit them. And they're actually synced in real time back and forth. And the software that does that was really poor on the Mac, really nice on Linux. I have no idea how it worked on Windows. But in the last year, 18 months, they've redone that whole subsystem, and now you don't really notice a big delay. On a M1 Mac, I do not notice any difference than like running locally, natively. It's complex, and this is true. In some ways, like I said, these things are not servers, but they act a bit like it, and it's kind of like if you were going to SSH to a machine to do things, but we can make that simpler, and we'll get to that a little further on. So this is the anatomy of a Docker file. A Docker file starts with from, and then it's an image. So this is going to be pulled, someone on the internet is maintaining this image called Ruby, and it's basically a very bare bones server with Ruby installed. If you do from Ruby like this, you'll get the latest version, so 3.2.1, I think, but you can actually say colon, 267. I use that a lot when I'm working on legacy projects where I can't update the gems for whatever reason. You can go all the way back to like 187, I think, if you really had to. The next line says copy dot to / user source app. Dot is the directory we're in, so this is going to be the source code of my application, my Rails app. User source app is in the container. It's on the virtual server. And so this is just copy all the files in there so that I can run them in the container. Workdir is the same as CD. I don't know why they didn't just call it CD. And then bundle install is going to install my gems, and then this is going to run Rails server -b, and you need to do the -b00 because it actually needs to, when you run Rails in development mode, it only binds to the local host on your local computer because you don't want it to be accessible from the internet. In this case, I need it to bind to the public IP address of my Docker container so that I can get to it from the outside being my computer. It's not available to the whole internet. This is the basis of it. This is actually a lousy Docker file, but if you read any Medium posts about how to do Rails in Docker, it's going to look just like this. The problem with this is that every time so Docker has this thing where anytime anything changes, it rebuilds that container. And if you set it up like this, anytime you edit a file, it's going to have to run bundle install because whatever thing changed invalidates the whole rest of the file. So it runs from the top to the bottom. So if I change a file, it's going to say, oh, I have to do that copy again, and that's going to do bundle again. So a much better one is to move that up to a separate step. Copy the gem file in by itself, run bundle, and then copy the files after bundles run. So that way when you edit files, it doesn't have to rebuild the whole thing and do bundle. This is better. I have a better one as we go further, but I'll have to explain some more concepts. So a compose file looks like this. And basically it's saying, I want to run a server, a container called app. When you have this build syntax here, it says I'm going to use the Docker file that's in the current directory. These two are just so you can do things like run ibug or pry. We'll get to that later. This is the command it's going to run. This says I want port 3000 in the container to be 3000 on localhost. So then I can just go localhost 3000, and it works just like I was working with a Rails app running natively. And then this is just saying, I want all the files that are in the current directory to be in user source app in the container. Some of this is duplicated with what's in the Docker file. And I'm not 100% sure whether it needs to be, but this works.
So right now, like that sits next to the Docker file as well.
Yes, so you have the Docker file, which is just sort of, here's how I build this image, which is going to be used to run the container. And the compose file, which is actually going to spin that up and start the container without having to do a whole lot of stuff on the command line. And it's going to create a network, which we're not using in this example. And it's going to create some DNS. So there's a host named app, which is, this is going to be the name of the DNS name of the thing, and also how it's referred to when you're running various commands.
Spike,
And then, yep.
Sorry, one question. Do you always track the latest version of Docker Compose? Like 3.7 I saw is up there. Like you just...
Yeah, that was the last one I knew that was the current version. So they're always adding features, and some things will cause errors if you have an older version of the Compose version. I'm not sure what happens if you leave it out. I've never tried. I think it defaults to an older version. That I could be wrong. It might default to them. So then if I run this,
It always goes for the latest, right?
you might go for the latest. So I run Docker compose up build. So build says, hey, run that Docker file, and up says, hey, start a network, and start the container. So if you can see the second to last line there, it says it's listening on 0003000. So there's actually a Rails server currently running. This would work, but it would be using SQLite for data. And as soon as you stopped it, this is an important thing to understand about Docker containers, they get rebuilt all the time, and anything that happens in the file system of the Docker container is removed when the container is rebuilt. So you wouldn't want to be using SQLite and writing files to the file system. And we'll talk a little bit about how you persist data in a bit. So kind of a more practical thing is, can I scroll this? Where's my mouse? Hang on. So this one, you see that has the same app thing, but now I have another one, database. Database is got an image instead of a build. So this is going to go out and pull down a Postgres image that somebody maintains. I think it's a Postgres core team. It will pull the current version of Postgres, but you can put : whatever. And again, you can go back to ridiculous versions from the early aughts if you need to. This sets an environment variable on the container, and this is what, I forget exactly what this is, but this is what you need if you're not going to do more complicated. This doesn't require whitelisting the host, which you don't need to do because it's a little internal container. If you don't do this, then you'd actually have to get in the container and manually add your hosts. And this is just like, it's okay, I'm running in a container. Don't need to do any kind of firewalling. And then over here, I've added an environment variable to the Rails container, which is going to set database URL, which the database.yaml file knows how to use. And so it'll just be able to connect to that Postgres database. And you can see here that the host name is database, and that is all automatically set up by Docker Compose here. And then we've added a new feature here, which, well, first let's show how it boots. So that now you can see there's the database has come up, and it's very chatty, but there's Postgres database listening on that host, and our Rails app can use it. So The other new thing is this volumes thing. So as I said, if you tear down your Docker container and start it up again, any data you wrote to it is gone. But obviously with a database, that'd be a real pain in the ass if every time we started our development environment, we had to reseed the database. So you can give it this idea of a volume, which is to say, okay, you have another disk in addition to your main one, and its name is DB data, and I want you to mount it on this path in the container. So that's where Postgres writes its data. And we're saying, okay, this is like an NFS mount for people who've worked with those before, or a remote disk on Windows. And we're just saying, this is where it's going to appear in the container. And then because Postgres writes its data there, it's actually going to be writing to this disk instead of onto its own. And then you need to define these down here. And when you define a volume like this in a Docker file, it says persist this. I don't care what happens to the container, but this disk just exists forever until I manually remove it. So basically, this thing will boot up. It'll write data to this volume. Every time it creates a new container, it'll still use that disk, and that disk will have whatever was on it before. So all my Postgres data persists until I'm done with the project and delete the thing, and then I don't have to worry about what it is in a few years. So we can actually use the same feature. So I mentioned that the whole having to build, rebuild the image when you change the gem file. Actually, I probably didn't say that out loud, but like, so we've changed it so if you change files, it doesn't have to rebuild the whole image. But if you change the gem file, because that was at the top of the thing, then it has to do another bundle. Also, because things don't live on disk, anytime the container goes away and comes back, it has to do a gem install again, because those gems have gone away, because they were stored in the container. So we can modify our file and add a bundle path environment variable. And that says, okay, I want to store the gems in this thing instead of under the project, which it normally does. And then Jeremy actually suggested that many years ago, why not make it go really fast since the thing isn't doing anything else? That's not necessary, but that just is like, install everything in parallel.
I think a more recent version of Bundle actually does parallelize it.
Yeah, it may do it by default now. And then we create another volume, which is this gems cache, just like we did with, well, so we have to spell that out in the definition of the app. Say, all right, we have this thing called gems cache that's mounted on /gems. And then we define it down here where we define as a permanent volume. So then those gems just persist and they're always there. And when you do a bundle install, it's just like, oh, I've got all these already. I just need to, use what's there. And if I add another one, it just gets in there.
And so just to clarify for my own, when I do like on Circle CI, right, I cache my gems and everything via SHA, like my app.sha for the gem file.log. That's not the same as what this is, which is like a local bundle install folder.
Yeah, it's a local bundle install into a small drive that's dedicated to holding the gems.
So, yeah, so you don't need to do a SHA kind of thing. I say cache.
But it is under the hood. There's all kinds of SHAs that are used by Docker and Docker Compose to see if things have changed. So that's how it tells if the gem files changed or the files have changed.
Okay.
It's keeping track of like, would the output of this command change? So I need to rebuild everything. But it hides all from your point of view. It just looks like a folder full of installed gems. So once we have this pattern, we can start adding things. So I don't know if anybody's played with Tailwind yet, the Rails 7 CSS thing. It requires you to run a separate command that watches for your CSS files to change, or your CSS templates, I think there are CSS files, and generates the CSS files. And so you have to, there's lots of ways you can do this if you're doing local dev, maybe use a proc file or something so that it starts both of them. Well, you can just put it on its own container. So now I have the app running, the database running, and a separate container that's just running Tailwind. And the Tailwind one looks just like the app one. It's using the same gems and all that, but it's just running as a separate process. And so and when I start Docker Compose, it starts automatically, so I don't have to remember I got to start Rails in this window and Tailwind in that window, and so on.
And that's actually using the same actual volume.
Right.
So they're sharing the disk volume between the two containers. It's mounted this.
Yeah, so it's two different containers with the same image. And so you don't have to build it twice. And so, well, now we have more stuff. I want Redis and Sidekick. So you can see I bring Redis in the same way as I brought in Postgres. It's just an image because all it needs to do is boot up and run a Redis server. Redis memory cache doesn't have a lot of configuration. And then Sidekick needs to run as a separate process using that same Rails image. And so we just do the same thing. It needs to talk to Postgres depending on how you're using it. It may not. And it needs to talk to Redis, so we put in the Redis URL, which is, again, that DNS for Redis is just set up automatically by Docker Compose. It's going to want to use the same gem cache and the same app mounting because it's running it's part of the Rails app, but a separate process. And then we introduced the thing I didn't call out before, but we have this depends on here, and that there's no guarantee order of how your Docker Compose file runs. So this is to say, like, don't try to start Sidekick until you know Redis is up. Do the same thing with the Postgres database in the Rails app and so on. That way you don't have things crashing on boot. So here's the trick to make this easier. As you can see, those files are getting long and complicated and hard to reason about. Well, it turns out you can have multiple compose files, and they will compose themselves into one big compose file. So here's the Rails one that I had before. No database, nothing fancy going on there. But then I can add a Postgres one. And the big thing here is in the second one, I can put some configuration for the app, even though it was defined in the other file, even though this is incomplete definition, this is going to get applied to or poured into what's already there. So when I put them together, the effective one will look like this. So it's pulled from the Postgres one, it's pulled in this additional environment variable to set that up. It's added the depends on database and the data, the DB data volume. So I don't have to have all that in one file. I can just have a whole bunch of them, and I just pull in the pieces I need from a collection. And so then Docker Compose actually just uses a .env file. So the simplest thing to do is just something like this. You define the files you want it to use, and it'll just glue them all together. You can do it on the command line, but it gets kind of unwieldy.
Is it colon separated?
Colon separated. I think they're thinking of them like paths, but
Yeah.
I don't know why they did that. So then I could just have one for Redis, and you can see it just kind of does that same, it's kind of set the Redis URL, add the depends on.
So that said app depends on Redis, but previously it was Sidekick?
Yeah, it depends. Like,
Or is it in the right way?
I think I didn't show I was actually adding it to both. Sidekick needs Redis, but if you're using like Action Cable, you need Redis.
Yeah. Got it.
You need Redis for your Rails app.
I see.
And that's where this example came from. You need PostGIS, then you could do that instead of Postgres. Could actually swap it out if your project suddenly needed it. Webpack. This is a little more set up, and I don't have this documented in this thing, but if you install Node and Yarn, you could do the same thing I was doing with the Tailwind process and have your Webpack dev server running if you're using that style of Rails and JavaScript. And again, it's just going to add what it needs, and I don't.
That node modules one is the nice one.
Yeah, so then all your node modules are living off in a volume. They don't get reinstalled every time, and they go away with your project and don't get indexed into Spotlight. There's a little more setup that you need to do when you build a Docker container, because the Ruby Docker container obviously doesn't include Node. And I did not put that in this, but I have a I will be sharing some resources. And then this is my personal favorite. I use this all the time. So if you're not familiar with ngrok, ngrok is a piece of software that lets you get a public DNS and SSL certificate for your local dev machine. I do a lot of integration work where I'm inside of Jira or Hootsuite or Adobe, and it has to be HTTPS because it's an iframe in an HTTPS page. ngrok's a great way to do that. You can just run it, you give it the URL of your dev environment, usually just the port, it's running on port 3000 on localhost. It goes out and does some stuff on their server to set up some DNS. And that DNS, when that's hit, it forwards to your localhost. There are other ways to do this with SSH tunnels and some open source things, but I just give them the $10 a year and don't have to think about it. So what this does is if you've used ngrok, you start your Rails app and in this window, you start ngrok in that window, and then it's working. This just runs it as another Docker container. In my environment, I have stuck my ngrok credentials in the .env file, and then the ngrok subdomain is just whatever I want to do, spikex. All of them are .ngrok.io, so it'll be spikex.ngrok.io. And this just runs, and I don't have to start it. I don't have to think about it. It shuts down when I shut down the project. I do pass it into in my apps, I tend to pass it in as that because Rails needs to know how it's going to be referenced. In dev, it'll only let you connect to localhost. So you have to add an extra thing. And then there's some code in your Rails to make this work. And also it's often useful for an app, especially if it's doing OAuth or something, to know what its URL DNS is, how to reach it. So that is one I use all the time. Okay, so as I said, it can be a little complicated to run this. I use aliases to simplify things because you have to run everything with Docker Compose something. So I just alias that to DC. I'm willing to bet that nobody in this room but me knows that DC is a Unix command. Mm-hmm. Oh, you would know it. It's the desk calculator. It's a reverse Polish notation calculator. Nobody has used since 1986. But if you just type DC and you know how to do those old HP reverse Polish calculators, it's kind of fun. And then in both Bash and Z Shell, you can build up aliases. So I have one that says bundle, one that's Rails, and then you can say, DCR console, and that'll just take care of opening the console inside the Docker container. And you can also do things like adding, I usually do this to add a gem. If you say bundle, add, then it just does it, and then I don't have to figure out how to get in the container and add this thing or edit the gem file and then run install. I like add, but
when you run DCR console, which container are you running that in, or is it a new one?
It's the existing one, and I actually realized that there's some typos in this, so it's not.
It looks like
right.
Oh, sorry.
Actually needs to say. Let's see if this takes effect. There's a little bit missing in that one command. Will we reload? I don't know. Oh, we did. Hey, look at that. It actually needs to have that, it actually should be app. That's what tells it where to run. And I left that out of the slide. So that says run the command in. So there's two things you can do with Docker Compose. You do exe, so you execute, which runs it in the running container. You can also use run instead, which actually will launch a container and run the command. You rarely want to do that, but it is an option. But then, if you're feeling confident, you can just do that. Oops. You can just alias them to, that's bundle, that's Rails, that's RSpec, that's Rubocop, that's whatever. And then it's just like you're working in the shell the way you do now. This is a pain in the neck, and this is the one thing I don't have a good solution for. Because these things are running sort of as servers, if you have a pry or a bybug, it doesn't just drop in the Docker Compose window, it doesn't drop into that. You need to actually attach, which is a Docker command, not a compose command to it, which gives you basically like a terminal that's sitting as if you were sitting in your shell with Rails running. And then pry or bybug or whatever will just work. But you do have to run that. If you don't, your app will hang because it doesn't have a terminal to talk to. And then this is confusing because if you hit Control-C to get out of this, it actually shuts down the container. You have to type Control-P, Control-Q. I do not know why, but that's the escape sequence for attaching. But I just leave this running in another window, and then my pries and bybugs and such pop up there.
When you leave it running, like you start your app up, you open another terminal and run it, it just looks like the logs?
Yeah, it just looks like the logs.
Okay.
So you've attached, so yeah, the logs will be coming out in the Docker Compose window, and those are all the logs from like the database and everything. When you do an attach like this, you actually just see the logs from the container you attached to.
Yeah, this is attaching your local terminal to the TTY of your container, so that the standard out of the terminal from the container is getting to your standard in of your local terminal, so they're bound together. And that's why your Control-C, when you hit there, is the same as sending Control-C to your Rails app, which is going to kill the Rails app, which means the process is going to die, which means the first process for the app has died. And so Docker says, my main process has died, so I need to shut down the container. So, it's great fun.
You gotta do that like 5 times before you have so much trauma that you don't.
How do you figure out the right thing to Google for that one?
There's probably remote too, like the remote versions.
Yeah, basically.
Yep.
So one last bonus, well, this is great, but I still have to have Ruby on my machine to get it started. Actually, no. If you create a gem file that just has the source line and then Rails gem, and then you have the Docker file and the Docker Compose files that I just showed you, you can actually install the Ruby gem, then run Rails new, and you have to do force so that it will overwrite the gem file that you created, and then you get all the files. So you can actually use this kind of stuff without ever installing Ruby on your own machine. Now, I use Ruby for a lot of other things, but if you don't want it, you can just do it this way, and then everything's in a container. And then, and once the container is created, of course, you commit it to Git, or once the Docker config is created, you commit that to Git, and the next person pulls it down, they just run the Docker Compose up, and they've got everything they need. I think I went too long, but any questions?
Yeah, I have one. Have you figured out the way to prevent you from accidentally running npm install or gem install locally on your M1 Mac?
Don't install Ruby
Don't install
or Node.
And then, if anyone who hasn't done this, because an M1 Mac is an ARM64 architecture and your Docker containers are not. So your binary gems, if you accidentally run them locally, natively on your Mac, and then you run them inside the container, you're going to get very fun and interesting errors. And it basically means you've got a binary incompatibility, and you've got a local drive that's been mounted into the Docker.
You could write a linter for
on binaries.
You could write a linter for that.
Linter for that?
Yeah.
The way you can solve for that, actually, you can solve it. There's a Docker ignore file, and you could tell it not to copy the node modules or the .rails gem, I think, or .gems, and that will probably solve that.
Yeah.
This is all work in progress. What I'm building up here, and I haven't pushed anything because I was working on my slides, is just here's a collection, here's Mongo, here's whatever that you can compose up in this way with some instructions on how to do that. A bootstrap script that does basically what this does. And I'm thinking maybe I'll eventually make this a Rails generator. I'm not sure. So they could actually get all those config files in without having to just copy and paste them.
Doesn't Rails ship with a Docker file now? Or they just started down this path? I'd be curious I'm guessing yours is better.
Hopefully. Theirs is pretty simple.
PRs are accepted. Yeah, PRs are accepted.
That's true. I don't know how much they'd want to I know, maybe Postgres. I'm not sure how far afield they would want to go supporting this. I've probably taken too long, so.
You can ignore folders with Spotlight, by the way, like your whole code folder, so you never get that crap pull up.
Just ignore all your files on your Mac, and then use Alpha.
It stopped working at some.
Maybe it's with Alpha that works for me then.
They
Yeah.
removed, I remember.
I never used
they removed the support for doing that with dot files. There is something to do with plist though, or something. They broke it.
But you can ignore a whole code folder. Everything's in root code. All your code's there. Ignore that folder. Then no problem.
There's a question on the call. Mazen, do you want to jump in? There you go.
Sure. So I have a question for you, Spike. So imagine like you with your Emacs editor or Vim editor, and you have those plugins that to set up with Prettier or Rubocop or whatever. Were you able to find a way to make that sync with a Ruby Docker image, so that it's not, so you don't have to install a Rubocop or those gems on your local machine, but your editor is communicating through the Docker container, like it's working through that?
Yeah, no, it's on my to-do list. It's technically, it's definitely doable if you use an LSP, because the LSP can run in the Docker container too. In fact, the Emacs LSP thing ships that way. So you could have if you delegate everything to LSP, including Prettier, Rubocop, and it's the Ruby one.
Standard Ruby.
Solograph or the
Solograph, yeah.
Shopify one is out now.
The Shopify one doesn't work with Emacs yet, so I haven't played with it. It only works with VS Code.
And Vim.
But I'm sure that'll get fixed, perhaps by me. So if you do something like that, where your editor, the way that those things work is, of course, it's just talking to a server. So you can specify a port that's running in your Docker container, and whatever it is can be running in there. I didn't do an example here, but I also have for really big projects, you can run Rubocop as a server. So I actually have set that up on one project where my Rubocop command actually talks to the Rubocop server, which is already, warm loaded Rails, and is a lot faster to load that way.
Cool,
There's
I'll
a
give
lot.
that a try.
What's that?
I mean, that's pretty cool. I think I'll give that a try. I mean, I found something similar on VS Code, which is, I think it's called def containers, where you have to create, there's a procedure for that, but I was just hoping to make it work something similar on Vim or Emacs. That would be cooler. Flex my Vim.
As long as you can specify a URL, a local host with a port, it should work.
Cool, I'll give it a try. Thanks.
All right, I apologize for taking up too much time.